Okay. Okay, so good evening, everyone. My name is Virginia Ann. I'm the lay pastoral associate at St. Basil's, for those of you who are joining for our first time. My co-worker, Marilena, and I are going to be your hosts for the evening. And if you remember from last week, Marilena did a great job with welcoming and facilitating. And so I'm going to try my best to echo those similar sentiments and reminders as we begin. So for those of you who have recently joined, it's just, again, another reminder to change your Zoom name to reflect the name you prefer to be called this evening. That will be especially helpful when we do our small group discussions. And speaking of small groups, you will see that some people have discussion leader bracketed in their name, and those will be our discussion leaders for the evening. So if you're a discussion leader, this is just a gentle reminder, you can put that in your name, and otherwise you may continue changing your name to the name you prefer to be called, and feel free to ask for help. Marilyn is really good at doing it really fast. So again, another reminder that we can help you with the virtual realities if needed. And again, so welcome back for those of you who were here last week, and welcome to those who are joining tonight. As some of you may remember, Benjamin was our facilitator last week, and he's advertised as our facilitator for the rest of the series. But Benjamin, despite the well-presented information he gave us, he was also in a lot of pain last week because he was on the verge of an exploding appendix. So as soon as our series ended last week, Benjamin's appendix exploded while he was on the way to the emergency room. So believe it or not, he presented the whole time in that discomfort, in that pain. And so if you noticed anything off, it was because he was in extreme pain, but still worked through it to be able to present. And he is actually still recovering because after having the surgery, he got an infection and then he got pneumonia. And so he was released from the hospital today, which is why he's not with us this evening, and he's hoping to actually join us again for next week, but we'll continue to remember him in our prayers. And now we can have an extra respect for him, knowing that he's able to present under such conditions. And of course, we didn't want to disappoint, so we have our facilitator for this evening. If you've noticed by now, his name in his Zoom name, he says Reed Lachlan, the substitute. So he is substituting for Benjamin, but he is, again, nothing short of great and qualified to present on this topic. And I'm not just saying that because I was Reed's student for 4 years in my undergraduate program. So Reed has plenty of experience and knowledge, and he is currently teaching students about this topic at the University of St. Michael's College. So Reed's an associate professor at the University of Toronto, and I'll let you experience his knowledge and wisdom and humility as he presents on this topic this evening. So just before we present on this topic, we will begin with a land acknowledgement by Deacon John Brown, and then an opening prayer, and we'll officially begin.
So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Toronto is on the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mississaugas, the New Credit First Nations, and the Métis Nation. We recognize the enduring presence of Indigenous people on this land and the importance of working to advance reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people here and right across Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And now we take a moment to place ourselves in God's presence. And I'd like to share a prayer that I read recently that I think is helpful for today. And this was also a prayer used for the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation a couple of weeks ago. So we place ourselves in God's presence, ask for humility and openness and authenticity as we try to navigate tonight's discussion with continual openness to the Spirit for ongoing awareness of how we can improve and work for justice for the peoples of Canada. And so we pray, O God and Creator of all things, we pray that the work of the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission will continue with renewed commitment for the people of so many nations who live in Canada. We ask for openness to learn the stories of the survivors of residential schools and their descendants. We ask to be counted among those who will listen, absorb, and learn with humility and gentleness. Inspire church leaders who will help us to continue the journey of healing and right relationship. Give our First Nations brothers and sisters the courage to speak, and give everyone the compassion and humility to listen. Make this presence, the presence of holy wisdom, guide us to healing and reconciliation in the way of truth, and give us the will to walk in justice and in right relationships with all peoples, all nations, and with the land. Amen. Now I invite Reed to begin our evening, or continue our evening, I should say.
Okay, I am going to bring up a PowerPoint presentation, and at the same time, I'm going to set a timer. So there we go. Okay. So first of all, I want to make clear that I am a settler scholar. I'm joining you from Rouge Tract of Williams Treaty Territory, which is actually a land that's the subject of a specific land claim by the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation at the present time. The topic of today's session is the role of the church in the residential schools. And I just want to sort of start, I put the substitute on purpose. So I'm here sort of pinch hitting for Benjamin, and I think by the end of my 20 minutes, you'll probably be very grateful that he'll be back. But I want to just sort of start by reminding ourselves what he covered last week. So in his presentation, he really drew our attention in a particular way to the sacred lifeways of Indigenous peoples and nations. He noted that these lifeways and these worldviews are diverse, but nevertheless there are shared values, there are shared themes, there are shared elements of the worldviews. And in particular, the most important shared value of all was a commitment to those sacred lifeways and an understanding of them as sacred. And you may recall that he started his presentation by saying that the reason to start with that is because this is part of what was under assault in the residential school system, and this is part of the harm and part of the part of what was feared to be lost. And in fact, the commissioners of the TRC talk about spiritual genocide, the attempt to remove these sacred lifeways through the residential school system. So that was the sort of the broadest context. And in the readings and in the video for this week, there was a shift to look sort of more directly at the schools. So we started with the broad context of Indigenous peoples and nations and their values and sacred lifeways. And we looked at the sort of the colonization project. And this week we're looking in particular at life in the schools. So what are the schools? We know very well they are schools that were, I was going to say funded by the federal government, but in fact, we know they were underfunded rather dramatically by the federal government. They were run in almost every case, not in every case, but almost every case by church-related organizations, and in particular, the 4 settlement churches. And one of those settlement churches was the churches that entered into a legal settlement in 2007 that created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And one of those churches, of course, is the Catholic Church. And about 60% of the residential schools were run by Catholic orders, many of them by the Oblates, but there were other orders and some dioceses involved in the sponsorship of residential schools. And in your reading and in the video, the third video in the series that was created by the Jesuit order in part in their work in reconciliation, you will have encountered the description, the fairly thick description of life at the residential schools for the students that experienced it. And the video in particular follows very closely the text of the Truth and Reconciliation, the larger volume of the report. So what was part of that experience? An inadequate education by any measure. Hard labor at least half days in most cases in the industrial schools. Ruthless suppression of language and culture. Persistent hunger, widespread illness, premature death for many of the children in the schools. Children who died buried in unmarked graves. Sometimes their deaths were recorded and sometimes they weren't. Physical and sexual abuse, and of course, importantly, acts of resistance on the part of parents who resisted surrendering their children to go to residential schools, even when the RCMP was empowered to seize them. But also the resistance of students themselves, finding recourse in sports and other activities, but also fleeing the schools at time to signal their resistance to the colonization project and the policy of assimilation that was being implemented in the schools. So this is all in your reading or in the videos. I'm not going to go through this in more detail. And instead, I want to spend the time sort of framing it to think about how, in particular, this is an event sponsored by Catholic Church, in particular, as a Catholic theologian, how to think about this residential school experience. How should it be regarded? How should it be framed? And I want to start with a very important educational theorist, Marie Baptiste Mi'kmaq. And in her book, Decolonizing Education, which is a really quite fine study, she draws our attention to she asked the question, sort of, why was the federal government involved in education in the first place, right? So why was the Canadian federal government, why were they implementing these schools in cooperation with the churches, in complicity with the churches? And she reminds us that a large reason why the federal government was involved in the residential school system and in education generally was because education was a treaty right and a treaty obligation. That in forming treaties, when the Crown formed treaties with Indigenous nations, they made a number of commitments. And one of the commitments that was often made was education. And this is because the leaders of many nations sought education. They wanted to receive education. And in fact, she says that in the early years of the Mi'kmaq, you have a really quite comfortable intermixing of both Catholic and Mi'kmaq traditions of education that, of course, exists in the 17th and 18th and then begins to come under pressure in the 19th century with the implementation of the residential school system. But I think it's important then to start with treaty as a broad context for the residential schools, that the reason that this passed into the care of federal authorities was because it was a promise that they'd made in many of their treaty relationships. So I think in order to frame the residential school system, one sort of has to ask, what is a treaty between Canada and an Indigenous nation, or also more locally? And importantly, in the context of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a treaty is a nation-to-nation relationship. Right? I think this is key and this is important, and this is one of the things that we're still sort of trying to recover. I say as a settler scholar, that we're still trying to recover, and a lot of that work right now is being done in the Canadian courts. A lot of the press is about what's happening in Parliament, but a lot of the really important work is also being done in the courts in terms of rebuilding that nation-to-nation relationship. But I think it's fair to say that when we think about sort of agreements between nations, the treaties aren't quite like, for example, if we said that a treaty is like NAFTA or the new NAFTA, whatever it's called now, I think it's fair to say that treaties aren't quite like that. They aren't quite like other relationships between states that we're familiar with. So what else is a treaty like? Again, not to say that it's not a nation-to-nation relationship, it is, and that's very important to reclaim, but to say that it doesn't quite capture the nature of treaties. Treaties are a kind of contract. Certainly, the settler state of Canada regarded them almost exclusively through a kind of contractual lens, in which they offered annuities or educational commitments in return for land. It's certainly clear that on the side of the Indigenous nations, what was being promised wasn't a ceding of land, but a sharing of use of land. Nevertheless, the treaties did have contract-like features. A treaty is a pledge of friendship or partnership between peoples. This is a wampum from the Treaty of Niagara in 1764. And you see that in the wampum itself, there's this image of two persons standing hand to hand in a relationship of real partnership. Treaties were nearly always marked by ritual and ceremony on both sides. So the Indigenous partners who entered into treaty often brought their own sacred ceremonies to mark the formalization of those treaties. But it was also the case that members of the clergy often negotiated treaties, and they usually marked treaties with Christian rituals as well. And so it was marked on both sides by ritual and ceremony. And so I want to say that one way to think about treaties that I think is very helpful from the point of view as a Catholic theologian is to think of a treaty as a sacred, committed relationship, right? It is a nation-to-nation relationship. It has features of a contract. It is like a partnership or friendship, but it's marked by ritual and ceremony. And so as an analogy, as a metaphor for what a treaty is, I think we can think of it as a sacred, committed relationship. And in the Catholic tradition, the place where we often think about sacred, committed relationships is when we talk about the Sacrament of Marriage, right? And I think this is important because when we talk about the residential school system, we're not just talking about something that was done. We're talking about something that was done that was also a betrayal of a sacred, sanctified, committed relationship that had been forged through treaties. And I think you can see this very clearly if you look at individual cases in which there were actual relationships in which Indigenous leaders invited Christians in to educate. So one good example is Chief Reverend Kakewakwanabe, also known as Peter Jones, one of the leaders of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And Kakewakwanabe was one of the founders of a school that became one of the schools of the residential school system, the Mount Elgin School in Muncie, Ontario, outside of London. This is where after the Mississaugas were displaced from their land and took up residence in Six Nations, Kakewakwanabe himself moved to Muncie, and he raised funds. He was a Methodist minister as well as a leader of his people. He raised funds to build an industrial school. His vision was to share training in technical arts with training in academic disciplines. So he had the industrial school model in mind. He worked hard to found this school, and just as it was about to open in 1850, he judged that his health had deteriorated too much for him to take the role as principal. So another Methodist principal was selected, and within the first year of the school's running, that school looked very different from what Kakewakwanabe intended. And one piece of evidence that he was disappointed in what happened in the school was that he continued to live for the rest of his life in Muncie, and he didn't send his children to the school. And so there was this specific moment where he'd raised funds and built a school, and the minute it opened, because he wasn't there to maintain some level of respect, it immediately became something unrecognizable to him. Another good example from Ontario is the Shinwok School in Bawating, or outside of Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. Here's an image of Chief Chingwa Khonse, an Anishinaabe leader. And he, and particularly his son, Augustine Shinwok, invited the Anglican Church to found a school in what is now Garden River Reserve. And this became the Shinwok School. And they had a really specific vision of what the school would be, that their vision was that it would be a school in which Indigenous traditions of knowing of knowledge and learning would be combined with European traditions of knowledge and learning so that students could benefit from both. The Shinwoks were practicing Anglicans. They were members of the Anglican Church. And they eventually also dissociated themselves with the Shinwok school system. Because as it took shape, especially after its first principal left, but even while its first principal was in place, E.F. Wilson, it became something unrecognizable, something doing, not just not doing what they thought, but doing something close to the opposite of what they had intended when they reached out a hand of friendship to the Anglican Church and asked them to found a school. I don't know the history of the Oblates well enough. I wouldn't be surprised if there were these very specific relationships in the founding of Catholic schools in Canada, but I don't know that the school in Spanish doesn't have quite that same kind of history. But I can talk about another school that has a similar history, which is one that I know well because I worked there for a period of time. In South Dakota, remember that the boundaries of the settler state of Canada and the US are not boundaries that are especially meaningful in this history. Makpialuta, or Red Cloud, was quite a prominent military leader among the Lakota, Aglala Lakota Nation in the plains of the US. And after fighting the Powder River War, which was a war that he won and fought the US forces to surrender, he visited Washington. He came back and made a decision that there was no way forward just through warfare, but that the settlers were basically too numerous, and that it was important for the Oglala Lakota people to learn how to deal with settler culture. And he said, how do we do this? Through education, right? So he, like Shinwok Konsei and like Kakewako Nabe, said, I will join with the churches to found a school. And so he, in this case, worked with French Jesuits to found Holy Rosary Mission, which eventually became Makpialuta, or Red Cloud School. And although it was in the US context, although it wasn't part of the specific narrative traced by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, the history of the Red Cloud School of Holy Rosary Mission parallels in almost every respect. It's called a boarding school, not a residential school, but it too did all of those things that we associate with the residential school experience in Canada. So again, it didn't just not do what Red Cloud intended. Arguably, for most of its history, it did close to the opposite. Now, if you're a reader of America Magazine, they've embarked on their own truth and healing work. Red Cloud is quite unusual in that the school is still operating. And I have to say that the Jesuits, I think now, would say that what they're trying to do now is to actually create the school that Makpialuta intended. But its history is not that. Its history directly parallels the histories that you will have read about this week. So I think that those relationships, the reason I give you those three examples, not every residential school was open, certainly not at the invitation of an individual Indigenous leader. But I think the places where we do see these relationships that are personal, in which an Indigenous leader says to a church, found this school for us, please run this school. We see that this image of treaties as relationship is actually embodied in really specific relationships in many cases, relationships of trust, relationships of partnership. And so the church's involvement in the residential school system, the church's complicity in a schooling system that didn't provide a good education, that was basically a work camp or even a work prison in many cases, that suppressed language and culture, that didn't care for its children, that hid the deaths of children from parents, that became a context for physical and sexual abuse, both of students by staff and of students by other students, and that only response in many cases on the part of students had to be some kind of act of resistance, or at least an act of willful survival. That this wasn't just a thing that was done that was unjust. This was actually a betrayal of a relationship, of a committed sacred relationship, of a committed sacred friendship. And so the church's role, I want to suggest, this is a metaphor. This is not intended to be taken literally, but metaphorically, the church's role in mounting the residential school system was like that of an unfaithful or even an abusive spouse, right? Who makes a promise, who enters into a relationship, and who uses that promise in that relationship not to honor it, but to destroy it. And so I'm going to stop there. Here are the sources of the images, and I will stop the sharing. But just to say that I offer the metaphor of a relationship, in particular a relationship that is betrayed. I think because it's just a metaphor. I mean, in terms of the treaties, I think it's really important in Canada's history to focus on the nation-to-nation relationship of the treaties. But particularly in the context of the church, I think that thinking about it as terms of a broken or betrayed relationship is very useful in thinking about both understanding the reaction of many people to the residential school system and the depth of the hurt, but also to think about what must be done, right? To think about how you repair relationships and the kind of work that requires. I think that using this metaphor of a relationship, which I think is a metaphor that works, but I think it's also useful for us in terms of seeing the really very hard work that is in front of the church in terms of repairing a betrayed relationship, which is different than simply undoing something that happened to be done. All right, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Reid, for giving us a context and to giving us just something to help us look at these difficult stories and timelines and experiences in a way that helps us be, I think, a little bit more sensitive and open to more dialogue and more listening and more healing. So as Reid has kind of allowed us to do with his presentation, we will now go into our discussion groups, and those will be about 30 minutes. And again, we invite you to share honestly and openly about the things that may have been stirring in you, even while you were reading from last week, from this week, if anything else has emerged, and just to respect each other's listening and to just be open and sharing. And if there are big questions that come up, feel free to hold on to them and we can bring them up into our big group discussion that will follow the small group discussions. And so again, a final reminder, you can change your name because it might be easier for your small group members to address you. And you will again be invited to keep your cameras on just to kind of facilitate that discussion and that, I guess you could say, sacred space where we can look to each other to help us listen to each other better. And so with that, Marilena will divide us and we will be reunited soon and hopefully in conversation and in this virtual reality. Because it's paused. Okay, and now I'll invite the discussion leaders to maybe share a point or two that came up or a theme that kind of came up in your discussion groups. So Sister Petite, Sister Sarah, Deacon John, Father John, or Sister Sonal, if you'd like to, one of you would like to share first, please feel free.
Oh, Petite's going, okay.
Oh, you can. Okay, I'll go first. I want to get it done and over with. I'm a nervous speaker. So we found that the metaphor that was shared by Reed very useful, and there were a lot of intense discussion surrounding that metaphor of sacred relationship and how that changes perspective vis-a-vis the legal concepts. Just to have a sacred relationship and how personal involvement and communal involvement is important in that context, rather than just think about the legal settlements or legal obligations of the Canadian society or each one of us. I think that I will share only one so that others can enrich the conversation also.
Thank you so much, Petite. And I think Sarah, you can go next because you're definitely ready.
Sure, thanks. I guess one thing to say is that even with the second week, that emotions are still very strong in the groups, that there is still a strong sense of anger, of sadness, of, I think, disbelief and shock. So the more that we learn, the more shocked we feel that our church participated in the abuse of children, in this sort of devastating decolonization or colonization effort. And just the harm that it caused to children and to generations of Indigenous people in Canada still. Just to build on what Petite said, the marriage metaphor was helpful. I think it helped us to understand why the hurt remains, because in fact, we are still in an abusive relationship with Indigenous people. So we think about, land rights or natural resource extraction, the continuing abuses that occur over resources. And so we are still exacerbating this relationship, that we are not healing it yet, but we are harming ourselves or each other in different ways, even now today. And just lastly, that there are a lot of questions because this abusive relationship continues, that we are questioning, what can we do next? Is it actually possible to heal? What is our role? What can we do in this situation?
Thank you, Sarah, especially for the honesty that the relationship isn't healed and it could still be one that is causing continual harm. So that's a really, I think, important point. And I just appreciate you sharing that, and those in your group who also brought that up. So I would like to invite another group to share. I see Sonal right here on my screen. So if you'd like to go first, Sonal.
Mark will speak on behalf. Yeah. Thanks, Sonal. I think we came up with a couple of perspectives, and interestingly, we had people in the group who have had experience, much more so than we normally get in Southern Ontario, living in Saskatchewan and out west, where they were much more closely in contact, and they remember how. They remember how some of the stereotypes that we've heard have come to be. They've lived much more closely and they've seen it. They didn't realize a lot of what has happened in the background. And then we looked at the residential schools in a couple of levels. And the first one is that it was a government effort that it was a government effort that we wholeheartedly participated in, and that we helped to execute. So even if we say, well, really, this was John A. Macdonald's idea, it wasn't just his idea, because there were cases where, there were many cases, obviously, where the execution of the schools was awful for the people in them. And then there were some bright lights. So you could see it could have been different. There were bright lights where there were some students, some schools that actually did portray what they needed to. There were some schools that did achieve some success in developing leaders and creating even a better culture for at least some of their students. So it was possible that it could have been better, which then came back to our general feeling of just shock at what has happened, and to a very great extent what we, and as people who are Canadians, as Catholics who are still shocked that our church was involved in this, and a wondering of how to take a next step forward. I think when we talked about the the analogy, it's actually a very sobering analogy, because if you think about it, and I think actually Sarah just said, it's we're still in this abusive relationship. But if we think about what that means, what counsel would we give someone if they found themselves in a relationship of that sort? Well, we tell them to disassociate themselves. We tell them to focus on themselves. We might ask them to seek forgiveness, or to seek forgiveness within themselves. But what we should expect is, we should not expect that they welcome us back. And all we can really at this point hope to do is listen and hope to do good. And I think maybe that's really like a next step that we have to think about. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Mark. Wow, it sounds like an enriching group that you guys went through a lot of layers. You all went through a lot of layers in what seems to be too short of an amount of time to discuss such depth. And again, I really appreciate the extension of the analogies and how it helps us think of moving forward and things like that. So thank you again to your group.
Thanks. And thanks to my group.
And I guess I'm just going to go with Father John, because I can't see either of you on my screen, but I'm just going to go.
Yeah, thank you, Virginia. And actually, just to carry on from what Mark just said, boy, really enriching discussion. Some were surprised in a group that there actually had been a real relationship in the beginning, of personal relationships between people. And the examples that Reid gave were rather interesting ones of Indigenous leaders actually expressing an interest in working together here. And that we know that was not the case in many other places. But then what went wrong? How did the relationship, how do we lead to get to this broken relationship? And there was a desire in our group to know more about that. How could that relationship be betrayed, be broken? What changed? And actually one of our participants likened it to elder abuse, and that in her situation, she's more familiar with elder abuse, which is another broken relationship. The marriage analogy stimulated a lot of discussion. Some thought it was quite relevant. It was an interesting one for me. I'd never thought of it in the same way. One of our participants distinguished a covenant from a treaty. And the way he approached it was, treaty is to kind of keep the peace. If you're having a war, then you come up with a treaty to keep the peace. And then covenant, it's very scriptural, but in scripture, a covenant can be between two very unequal partners, right? Between God and his people, for example. What was each party thinking when they got into that treaty? Were there mixed motivations? What did they understand by that treaty? And one very provocative comment from our group was, did they understand, was the understanding so different that there's grounds for an annulment of this marriage, which is interesting. Because as we know in Catholic practice, if the right intention wasn't there in the marriage, that might cast a doubt on the validity of that marriage. But certainly the church gets very involved in the state, and that's part of the problem. And then we got to the issue of what can we do now moving forward? The question was, what is dialogue? What does real dialogue look like? And how are we as Catholics, as Christians, called to enter into dialogue with Indigenous people? What does that look like? How do you actually dialogue in a meaningful way? So anyway, very good discussion. Many people were quite disheartened that relationship was broken, but I think there's a great desire in our group to figure out how can it be mended? How can we move forward to repairing the relationship through dialogue? Thank you.
Well, thank you as well. And to your group for bringing up, I guess, more questions that I saw Reid nodding his head. So maybe he's already thinking of some ways to answer. And then again, an encouragement to, if you have experiences in answering those questions, like the how to, and maybe you've had those have been making those efforts, or know of organizations or individuals, or have had those experiences personally where you have taken those steps and can even answer the how to. So I again encourage those to be shared. And next, I guess especially as next week we talk about the TRC, particularly those calls to action. So again, these thinking of how to's and asking why, but thinking personally, how can I, how can we, how can all, I think will will continue to enrich our discussion next week and beyond. And I think our final group, Deacon John, would you like to share? Or
yes. Excuse me. I think in our group, I tried to take them up to the top layer of all this, which was Canada's Aboriginal policies. John A. Macdonald, Edgerton Ryerson, Duncan Scott Campbell. And the central goals of the Aboriginal policies were through a process of assimilation to cause Aboriginal peoples to cease to exist. As the Truth and Reconciliation Report tells us, it was the goals of Canada's Aboriginal policies were cultural genocide. And one of the establishment and operation of residential schools was the central tool Canada used to enforce that policy. So right from the get-go, there wasn't any real relationship between Canada and the Indigenous people. Canada wanted to get rid of them. And residential schools became a way for them to do it. Now, Canada then asked the churches to become complicit with them in it, I guess calling on their missionary zeal to help convert the Indigenous children into white Christian European children. And so the whole goal and aim and purpose of the schools was cultural genocide. There's nothing good about that aim. Whether or not there were maybe one or two schools where good things happened is beside the point, because the aim of the schools is as I stated it. And so what you end up with is the government calling and treating Indigenous people savages, and that attitude and the government policies permeating and percolating throughout the residential school system by underfunding, by treating Indigenous people as less than human, which led to underfunding, lack of food, lack of proper accommodations, taking their names and their culture and the language and tradition, the spirituality away from them. And so when you get down to the level of the Catholic Church or the Anglican Church or the Baptist Church or the Oblates and what they did in furtherance of that policy, perhaps there you could say that is a betrayal. And I would say, of course it was, because the faith of each of those churches should have stopped the people from being part of the overall goals of the Aboriginal policies of the government at the time. And that's why there was such a betrayal of the faith of the churches to think that it was a good thing to treat Indigenous people this way. I'm going to stop there.
Got that.
I say thank you, John, for again adding a lot of heart to the discussion of the how frustrating the intellectual and the historical and current realities could be, and how much more needs to be done. And it sounds like your group went into a good amount of depth. And again, those layers and how again, on the macro level, the negative intention is already such a way of viewing everything as horrible, and our need to really step up as the current people of God to remedy, to reconcile, to even begin a relationship after such destruction. And I think, Reed, again, I saw you nodding your head, and if you would like to comment, and then we can open up for more questions. I think you probably heard some as well.
Sure, and I mean, so first of all, it sounds like these were incredibly fruitful conversations, and I want to say that in terms of taking credit for things, like it seems like the metaphor that I offered was useful. Even those of you who disagreed with it, actually, I think it sounds like that was really fruitful, and so I'm really grateful for that. again, it's not, I mean, I guess applying it to marriage in particular, I don't know of anybody else who does that, but I'm very indebted to lots of Indigenous theorists for thinking about this in terms of relationship. John Barrows is a really important one. But I do think that one of the things that I think presents itself in a lot of y'all's response is that the residential school system, I mean, and this is sort of kind of a spontaneous, not as well thought out as maybe it should be the response, but I think that it's important for sort of members, people whose primary reference point is as a member of a church, for example, the residential school history. I think it's important to make distinctions between the church and the government, and we don't make them because in the mounting of the residential schools, of course, they were working hand in hand, right? So I don't want to don't misunderstand anything that I'm going to say as sort of downplaying that in any respect. So from a period of time from 1888, more or less, maybe 1850, if we want to go back to some of the early schools that became part of the system, to 1996, when the last one closes. I would suggest that we can imagine that as this is a period of time when the churches and the government are working hand in glove, right, to implement a policy of cultural genocide. But the reason I want to sort of put those bookends on that is because before that, 17th, 18th century, although the church is also complicit in different ways, right? So the doctrine of discovery is a doctrine articulated out of the Catholic tradition and then picked up, not just in the Catholic tradition, but by a lot of European powers. So it's not like the church, I don't want to suggest it has no roles, but on the ground, the church played a lot of different roles in relationship to Indigenous nations prior to this kind of close partnership. And I think that's important because it can again, right? So, and I mean, even the marriage analogy that I proposed, I actually think works much better for the church's relationship than it does for the state. I mean, for the state, it really is this nation to nation relationship. John, to your point, I think it's correct to say that the government never had a prior relationship, if by what we mean is the Dominion of Canada, federated in 1867, that government never had a relationship. That government's policy was always a policy of cultural genocide, that from the moment of Confederation, pretty much. But I do think that the pieces that went into that government also have a more complex history, right? So the Treaty of Niagara in 1764 is the treaty that the commissioners go back to and say, there was this relationship. Now, how sincere was it? I mean, like we can get into sort of a, but I think for them, sincerity doesn't matter so much. There was this treaty that was forged, and that becomes a resource for us to go back to and say, there was this relationship, at least in principle, at least in wampum, right? There was a vision of a relationship that could be. And so the same thing with the churches. I think, I mean, one of the things that's really interesting about Marie Baptiste's work on the Mi'kmaq peoples and their connection with the Catholic Church quite early in the history of colonization is that she says in their early history of the French Catholic priests working with Mi'kmaq people, you have what she says is the vision of education that we could have, right? Now, it's not because people are well-intended. One of the priests she talks about lies to the Mi'kmaq people about the French Crown's intention, right? He's a Jesuit, sorry, John. But for me, that's important because it's not based on intention. It's based on the relationship, being one of equal partners in that context. So let me just say that, and then let me just say one other thing about the marriage relationship, and then I'll stop and we can have some further conversation. If we use the analogy of, let me use abuse. I mean, actually, it's appropriate, but so let's use abuse. Okay, so abusive relationship or a question of infidelity. When you think about how to repair that relationship, you always have to talk about two different things. And I think this is why it's important, why it might be useful. The first thing is for the abuse or the infidelity to stop, right? So in order for that relationship to continue, one of the discussion leaders said, usually we'd say, distance yourself, protect yourself. And that's right. But if the relationship is to continue, the first condition has to be for the behavior to stop. Right? But that's not the end, right? So, and I think that this is one of the difficult things that we encounter, is that if it's a relationship, that's the beginning of the process of healing. That's the necessary condition. And then if you think about relationships that do survive that kind of rupture, then, I mean, we can play with the metaphor. So somebody said, some of the schools did good things. Spouses who say, well, I did some good things, even though I was abusive, I mean, I'm not trying to criticize that group. I'm just trying to sort of play with the metaphor. So you don't typically make those claims, right? Because the project is on you to build trust, right? Over a period of time. It's just a metaphor. I'm not sort of invalidating the observations, but then the last presentation said, we can't claim any of those good things. And if you think about it in terms of relationship, you can say, well, maybe there were good things that we done, but those can't be what we lead with, right? We have to lead with, we betrayed the relationship, and now we need to build a new trust. And I think that that's a useful metaphor to say the first step is for the abuse or infidelity to stop, but then the lifelong project then is to become the faithful partner that you were supposed to be in the first place. And that's not something that's done in a year or 2 years. In the case of a marriage relationship, that's the rest of the marriage. Yeah. Right. Thank you, Andrew. Yeah. So 500 years to destroy, 1,000 years to heal, maybe, right? But at least a lifetime, right? Or that might be all we have, any of us individually have, right? But it's at least going to take my whole lifetime that I have remaining, right, to begin that process, just as one example.
Thank you, Reed, for...
That was a little preachy, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you for beginning to reopen our big discussion. But if there are any particular questions, and I'll invite you to raise them now. You can raise them in the big group by, I think it's easiest if you use the reactions feature. And if you click or tap on the reactions, you'll see the raise hand. So you may use that, or you may post your questions in the chat as well. And I already see 2 people with their hands raised. Mark, Anthony, you can go, and then Doris right after.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Lachlan. I always do admire how you seek to make distinctions. And I think that it's really helpful. Especially, I know I work in a school, and education is extremely important. I know that as I was doing the readings for today, one of the things that kind of came to my mind was how important it is that, yeah, you're not going to be able to repair all of that damage, but you can start with educating and never letting what happened be forgot. And John Brown, Deacon John, I thought what your words about how we were complicit and guilty, I think is really a wonderful place to start, because it reminded me of when we're at Mass. We start by calling to the foreground our sins. You can't possibly begin to heal unless you unearth the truth of your sin. And so I think that the importance of education, reminding people of this history, is a really, really important place to start if we ever intend to heal. So thank you so much. I don't really have anything compelling to say, but I did want to say thank you for all of that.
Thank you for your comments, Mark Anthony. I saw some applause from some other reactions, so thank you. And now Doris, go ahead.
Thanks. If I may, I have a little bit of a challenging thought. Would that be okay to share in this forum? I'd like to suggest that we take it even further than that of a relationship. I found that metaphor very useful. The reason I say further is also what Mark Anthony just brought up, let us never forget what happened. So this is where I think of Auschwitz. This is a different version, but there is an element that's beyond an abusive relationship, where the complicity and cover-up is so profound. What I'd like to suggest is we take a look at how Germany healed, because I've known many people, and healing is possible, where that culture has regained its respect, where this was so deeply rooted in a particular pockets of people. So what I'm saying is that I think the depth of this would free everybody up. And a relationship may be possible, but rather than all or none, to actually be able to build memorials. Like you wouldn't do that in a broken up marriage, but you would in something this serious as cultural. And those that never want to talk to another Catholic the rest of their life, that's like there's no judgment on that. But I think there could be really profound healing. And just taking a look at, I was really struck and learned a lot by the generations of Germans involved in my life and how they were able to heal and still claim that there was some part of their heritage that did this outrageous thing. Just to add to the discussion.
So let me just respond quickly to that and say thank you. Murray Sinclair makes that exact parallel in an interview that he recently gave on the show Unreserved. I just put the link to, and he draws an example. He makes exactly the analogy that you've just made, and I do think that that reminds us that what we're talking about is a systemic issue, not just a personal issue. I mean, I think the language of relationship is important, but I think I agree basically with everything that you said, and so does Murray Sinclair. So that's not bad company to keep. And I think that this also gets at Audrey Farrer. You put in the comments that you have to look at the question of power, right, and power disparities. And I think that's also part of the systematic question and important observation to make. Right? The analogy doesn't capture a lot of that. Yeah.
But it's still important. It's part of it.
Yeah, it captures a piece. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just trying to make note of hands that are clapping and hands that are raised. If I'm too slow, feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead. But Mark, I did see your hand up.
I've talked a fair bit, so just really quickly, I want to agree with what Doris said. Actually, one of the first things that came to my mind as I read through the book was the visit I made to Auschwitz, and what having read the history and then having, basically stood there on the grounds and effectively felt the spirits of the place talking to me. It certainly isn't. It's not. I can see the parallel. The one thing I might say is there probably is a bit of a difference of degree, but I also don't want to play that too much, because the issue is, if we want to actually heal, we have to actually, I think we have to show ourselves. We have to put it in our faces. We have to understand that it was there, and we have to make sure we never forget, so that we don't make the same mistake. So I'll just leave that.
Mark, and I think on the screen that says Katarina is next.
Okay, well, actually, it's the pseudo Katarina here, Robert. I really appreciated Doris's remarks as well, but something had occurred to me just before she started speaking, and that was about enculturation. And in the Amazon Synod in October of last year, the degree to which that was emphasized, and the idea that was promoted very strongly, and this is very much done by Pope Francis, of respecting the cultures of peoples who are members of the church, and actually acknowledging their ways of understanding themselves and worshiping and so forth. And I think that something that we as the settler majority of Catholics in the Catholic Church in Canada have not only done as a damage to Indigenous people, but also have done as a damage to ourselves in missing out on very rich things that we ought to have benefited from. And if we start making an effort to shift our liturgies and our practices of various sorts in Catholicism within Canada, so that it starts looking not just European, all right? It starts becoming enculturated in this northern vast land with its issues and with its rich traditions and spiritual understandings and so forth. I participate in that kind of stuff because I'm a church musician. And I would very much look forward to being part of that kind of sharing and taking on of other features that we ought to be appreciating, and that I feel deprived, that I don't know, and that hasn't been available to me. So in the part of one generation that's left to me, that's something that I look forward to working on, and I hope it has the outcome that Doris's remarks suggested need to happen.
Thank you, Robert. I think what you mentioned about moving steps forward and starting with the other instead of doing everything, thinking of what to do for ourselves is a good place to start. And I think maybe Reed, you can touch on those two questions that are in the chat that kind of go together. And how do we stop the abuse? And is there more that we need to acknowledge as the church before kind of taking or in doing at the same time as doing something that Robert's suggesting of those moves of action. So maybe bringing those two questions together, and then we can get to Father Norm's question.
So I'll just be very brief here. I mean, I think that I want to make a distinction between what the church can do and what the church can do directly, and then what the church can do indirectly, right? So it seems to me that what the church needs to do directly, I would say that the first step is to steps. That one of the calls was to repudiate the doctrine of discovery, and that the Catholic Church did that right away, pretty much. But we all are aware of the ways in which this has not occurred, right? So, and in particular, the call for the Pope to come and apologize as a first step, right? Not as the end of the process, right? But as the real beginning of when the commissioners asked for the Pope to come and apologize. That's the real beginning of the process. That's not the end of the process. But I think that with regard to land and the use of land, I do think that the role of the church is limited. Now, the church profited from, I mean, if you've read about the Oka crisis, right? The Oka crisis was land that was sold by the Sepulchans, right? It was land that had been appropriated by the church and then sold, right? So the church has a direct role in restoring land and restoring the use of land, but its role there is going to be, in the broad scale, much more indirect. So can the church stand unambiguously with Indigenous nations to restore the rights to use of the land and to protect the land itself? I mean, that's more of an indirect role. I mean, there are cases in which the church has a more direct role, but usually that's going to be indirect. So I think it's useful to think of those two things, is to say, what does the church do directly? And again, the first step is to just look at the calls to action and to follow them. One of which, Mark, to your point, is to make sure that our textbooks actually tell the truth, right? And not just our textbooks, but the way that we teach. But then to be an ally, which is not always easy to do, and there are diverse nations, and sometimes you make mistakes. So I think, Norm, you have your hand up.
Yes.
Father Norm.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I just realized that I wasn't waving. I was trying to get your attention. As a comment, Doris and Mark both pointed to Auschwitz, and I think there's a more basic thing that we need to address and take ownership of. A year or two ago, Jim Wallace, who is a kind of political theologian, I don't know if theologian is the right word, commentator, Christian commentator, wrote a book called "The America's Original Sin," and labeled it as racism. Germany's original sin was anti-Semitism. And I think we're dealing here with trying to identify our original sin here in Canada, which was the fertile soil, racism for slavery, for all the stuff from slavery on, Auschwitz, anti-Semitism for all the destruction that came from that. And this may be our original sin in terms of trying to, it preceded any plans for the residential schools. That was the fertile soil in which those seeds were planted. So I think we have a systemic cultural problem to deal with and moving forward. I don't have a slightest idea how to proceed, but I think that's predominant. That's the basis that we have to build from is changing the culture, our culture.
Thank you, Father Norman. I see Marilyn put the book reference into the chat, and I'll add that resource as well as the was it a CBC interview that Reed mentioned earlier that I'll put into the reading guide for everyone to look at. Was it an interview, Reed? Or
It's the show Unreserved. And that was a particularly good interview. He speaks rather specifically about the Catholic Church. I also think that's a good interview because the question is posed of him, is this something basically that settlers have to do, or is it something that Indigenous peoples have to do? Who's involved in reconciliation? And his answer is very good. And he disagrees with Rosanna Deerchild, who's the interviewer, a little bit. But he argues that Indigenous peoples also have to be involved in reconciliation, but the work that has to be done is different, right? So, and so I've really been speaking. I know that we're not all settlers in this group, at least we weren't last week. And so I don't want to presume to speak for everybody on the call in terms of the work you need to do. I'm speaking just as a settler.
Thank you for adding in that comment too, Reed. And I wanted to know if anybody had any final questions or closing remarks they would like to share or pop into the chat quickly, or just to unmute and add a question or a comment before we wrap up for this evening.
I was in New Zealand a couple of years ago, and they've done some terrific, they're really more aware of the Aboriginal rights, and they're speaking the language, and the whole, a very positive attitude. Now, again, not perfect, but New Zealand is a country that's really, that's made big strides.
I guess another question or comment I would have is, where else, like, Reed, would you look for resources about what to do? I know there's maybe like on a national level, are there other countries you could recommend that we could look to, or is it helpful to maybe look to some of the maybe more grassroots initiatives, or is again levels?
So I mean, I'm really very cautious about speaking as, an authority on this. There are others on this call, I suspect, who have better notions. But just to say that, my colleagues in Indigenous studies will say that on the ground level, the idea is to form relationships, right? And to make oneself vulnerable, right? But in terms of institutional initiatives, beyond sort of keeping the pressure on our bishops they've made some good moves recently to keep our pressure on them to fulfill the obligations that they've made. I think that the most fruitful place to invest, at least my colleagues in Indigenous Studies will say, to invest in language. So if you're looking for an organization to support, there are lots of organizations. The Legacy of Hope Foundation is quite good as an educational organization to keep that truth in front of us. But again, my colleagues in Indigenous Studies would say that there is almost nothing that's more important than language and the loss of language. And here, New Zealand's a good example. Hawaii is a good example. So it's partly it's supporting language initiatives, but also, I mean, like in New Zealand, families can advocate for Indigenous languages to be part of an immersion program at their school. And one of the things that really changed things in New Zealand was that the parents who advocated for that weren't all Indigenous, right? So non-Indigenous families wanted their children to be in an immersion program with an Indigenous language. Hawaii is another good example of really effective Indigenous immersion program. So just to say that this isn't my insight. This is an insight that's borrowed from colleagues in Indigenous Studies, but the most damaging loss is the loss of language. And so in terms of beyond just the interpersonal work that has to be done, any effort that we can make to restore language to those, to anyone, including to ourselves, to strengthen Indigenous languages is not wasted.
Thank you very much for bringing that up. And Marilena, thank you also for putting another resource in the chat for us to look at. And I think, again, I'll add them to the reading guide. And there are plenty of things at the bottom of the few pages to I guess, maybe inspire more action and more resources and more learning. So feel free to use those. And Audrey, I see your hands up. I'll give you, I guess, the last word before closing remarks.
Thank you again for everyone sharing their thoughts. These are really great points for reflection. I was just wondering, Dr. Reed, you had mentioned at one point, one of your comments was you saying that, not all of us here are settlers and you wouldn't presume to speak for everyone. And I was just curious, this idea that we're not all settlers, because I was wondering, even though I was born in the Philippines and I immigrated here, why would I not be considered a settler? I'm still benefiting from a lot of the privileges that all Canadians have, or I shouldn't say all, but that many Canadians have that have resulted from the unfortunate abuse of Indigenous peoples. So I was just curious why you would not recognize everyone as settlers.
So first of all, just to clarify that what I meant was that in one of my small groups last year, one of our participants self-identifies Indigenous. That's what I meant. Okay. So, but to your point, I would consider anybody who comes to Canada voluntarily to settle a settler. But if John Crouch is one of the does a lot of Indigenous cultural awareness programs, and again, this isn't original to me. This is his insight. He's Anishinaabe, and he will say that not everybody who's non-Indigenous is necessarily a settler. Somebody whose ancestors were brought to these shores in chains as enslaved peoples in the transatlantic slave trade, he doesn't consider the descendants of enslaved Africans settlers, right? Because they weren't part of the settler project, right? they're non-Indigenous, but they're not settlers in the same way. And so I do think that distinctions are important. And I do think it's important to say that not all settlers are equal in their complicity either. But I do think that your main point, I basically agree with completely. Anybody who benefits from the expropriation of the land is part of the settler project, even if, not to put too fine a point on it, but people who present like me, have a longer history with this project, if that makes any sense. Yeah.
Yes, it does. Thank you so much for clarifying that.
Thank you again, Reed, for subbing in for Benjamin. Remember, everyone, pray for him and his recovery. And thank you again all for building relationships with each other in this virtual way and through this communal but also virtual reality. Thank you for your vulnerability, your openness, and continuing to listen and learn together. And just as a reminder that next week we have our last listening and learning kind of session until we do our liturgy on the following Tuesday. So I wish you all a good night and thank you again for coming. And yeah, we look forward to seeing you again next week. And I just wanted to invite the discussion leaders to stay on the call, and I wish everyone else a good night.